Hello everyone, welcome into my cosy corner of the internet. I'm Danielle and in today's video we're talking about the books that I ended up finishing reading in April. I think there ended up being 11 in total, might have been a couple of more DNFs as well. I do have my list here for everything that I did read, so I will go over kind of a plot summary. They will generally all be spoiler free and I'll let you know what I thought of them as well, whether I'd recommend them, all that kind of thing. But if you haven't already, pause the video, grab yourself a cup of coffee, a cup of tea, nice hot chocolate, something like that, and just settle in with me as well. So the first book that I ended up finishing back in April, and it feels like a very long time ago now, was The Nightingale by Kristen Hanna. And I ended up giving it 4.5 stars. I was close to giving it a full 5, but for me there were just a few moments that could have had a little bit better descriptions. That it was obviously overall a very descriptive book. Everything that happened allowed you to feel like you were with the two sisters as they were going through their own struggles during World War II and navigating sort of the political and social environment. But at other times there were just moments that I felt I could have done with a little bit more. There had been that little bit more, I probably would have ended up crying. I became on the verge of tears a few times, but it didn't necessarily quite hit me enough. The thing that mainly gets me in the end bit of the book is if Kristen had provided me with a little bit more detail on what happened to the other women in the book, seeing as this is a book that's basically all about women empowerment, women's strength, women's stories, it would have been good to have then had a bit more background as to what happened to the other women at the end. They're mentioned by name as being present in this particular place at this particular time, but we don't hear anything more on them. And I appreciate that, yes, the story is focused mainly on the two sisters, but it would be nice to know how these other women managed to sort of survive and navigate as well, even if it had just been an extra short chapter on it from their perspectives or sort of an additional summary as to what had happened. That would have been a really nice way to have rounded it out. And I think for me that combination would have then lifted it up to a 5-star read. But it was definitely a very good one, and I can see why Kristen Hanna is a sort of a well-loved author in the historical fiction genre, because there was good amount of description in terms of building up the scenery. There was a bit where they discussed the flowers and the way that they would have been smelling, the way that the sun was, the air, all that sort of thing. And it really allowed you to feel that you were there, which definitely helped to build up into making you feel like you were in the story with the character. Like I said, I just wish that there had been points where it discussed a little bit more what happened to the other characters in the book as we went further along, as they were kind of brushed over a little bit, and that sort of did upset me a tiny little bit, but not too bad, not enough to make me sort of want to knock it down any more than I already did. But let me take a look to see what my second book was. So that also, when I was reading The Nightingale, it was a physical copy, but then the next one I finished was Emmaline by Ashley O'Connell, and I gave this 4.5 stars as well. But I was doing this one through NetGalley, so it was an ebook, which means that for me, I normally end up reading physical books a bit slower than I do, say, an audiobook, because I have less time to be able to sort of sit there physically with pages in my hand, and that also then applies with ebooks as well. But Emmaline is basically about a family, or in this case, mainly one woman, Emmaline, that starts off as a child in Wiltshire, I believe, and then they move to Liverpool in the prospects and the hopes of their family having more work opportunities and to sort of have more money, escape poverty, escape struggles, escape some previous things that had happened in their lives that they were perhaps trying to forget and escape. When they're in Liverpool, they end up encountering some Mormons doing some sermons, and they then end up taking the crossing across from Liverpool to the United States, and then take the long cross-country journey across the States to get to sort of the land where all of the Mormons have been going together. And at this point, Emmaline is very young and ends up sort of in a difficult position in terms of who they're placed with, who they will be placed with, in terms of where they're staying, what their relationship is like with their family, their friends, the friends that remain after all of that journey. And it's a very troublesome book in the way that it, again, is a very strong female character that has to push through a lot of adversity, a lot of struggles, and find ways to be able to trust people, to be able to trust themselves and their decisions as they are growing up. And, you know, there were moments of it where I was gobsmacked, and it left me to go and do extra research on certain things. But I definitely think that it helped for this book that it was based on some of the author's family's history, sort of diaries, records and things that they'd found. Some of the names of the people in here were real people. So it's definitely incredibly interesting in sort of that way of seeing how they blended fact and fiction together. I think for me, there were certain moments that stopped it again from being a 5-star, but it wasn't anything too terrible. And this isn't why I knocked it down, some of the points, but as somebody that isn't in the US or didn't grow up with US geography history, I obviously did live in the US, but again, I didn't spend the time studying a map deeply. I think it could have really done with, especially if and when it goes to being a physical print copy, a map on one of the pages, perhaps the front, the sort of covers or something on the inside, that shows the different pinpoints of the locations that they go to during their travels, just so we can, as sort of an outside reader, can perhaps get a better understanding of the expanse of the journey. You know, I'm aware that, yes, it took them so many days, so many weeks, that they had to go past all of these landmarks, but that meant that I had to then go onto Google Maps and try and pinpoint it and figure it out. So I think if that was something that was automatically included in the book, that would perhaps be a more useful guide to appreciate the vastness. But like I said, that definitely wasn't why I knocked it down half a point. If anything, I more knocked it down because I was pleased at the ending, because it was a nice, happy ending for the person, the circumstances, everything around them. But it felt almost like they'd perhaps been able to brush their troubles aside quite a lot. And I'm not saying that they did, perhaps, you know, but there definitely felt like there was sort of most people that would have gone through that would have really struggled and really, even with resilience and the ability to bounce back, they would have still had big moments of doubt. And instead it felt like there was some childhood naivety from this person, even though that person had even though Emmaline in many ways had been told to sort of grow up way too young, it kind of felt disconnected in some ways, like it didn't entirely make sense. But it was overall a really, really good book. And like I said, it definitely got me to think about that journey and the sort of the struggles that people face, what expectations they had versus the reality as well. My first 5-star read of April was another physical book, and it was The Couple at No. 9 by Claire Douglas. I actually picked this up off of a free sort of mini little library shelf at one point, and I wanted to give it a go to see whether it was any good. You know, I know that Claire Douglas has a lot of different books, and I was not at all disappointed by this book. It does, as the title suggests, follows a couple at No. 9 that have moved into the property after being given it as an inheritance. They've moved away from London to be able to do this house up whilst they're in the process of starting a family. And they get it so they're going to be doing an extension to have a bigger kitchen and everything. And one of the builders rushes over and says that they seem to have found a body. Turns out there's 2 bodies in the back of their garden. And from there, the entire plot obviously discusses how these bodies came to be there. Who are these people? And is there any involvement to the couple, to the sort of the history of the house and all that sort of thing as well. It was definitely a very moving story, especially at the moment, the sort of the bits where it intertwined sort of one of the older family members and their struggles with sort of dementia and Alzheimer's, and how they were able to share some bits of the story but not others, and then how some of it sort of, perhaps they did still have the ability to remember and they could have explained, but they chose not to. And it was obviously a moment, like I said, there was definitely lots of heartbreaking moments. There were so many twists and turns, and every time I thought I was starting to figure it out and be able to put the pieces together, something happened that made those thoughts unravel a little bit. But by the end, it sort of all started to come together, and I reached, I want to say, sort of about 85% of the way through the book. And I didn't want to put it down because it started to get so much more fast-paced, so much more intense. All of these different lines and stories, possibilities were starting to come together. And in the end, we got a sort of the answer and the outcome. And it was, it was obviously pretty sort of like I said, it was heart-wrenching at some points and sad, and you can sort of start to have some emotion behind it of trying to understand sort of what's going on. But yeah, it was a really good read. I happen to have another one of Claire Douglas's books, and I'm definitely looking forward to giving that one a go as well. My first 3-star read of April ended up being an audiobook, and it's one that I've seen so many people talk about and generally seem to love, but that was Hooked by Asako Yuzaki. And this one, if you don't know, happens to follow two separate women in Japan, where one of them is sort of a stay-at-home wife lifestyle blogger that has amassing quite a following and potentially getting a book deal, all that sort of thing. And then we have somebody else that lives at home with their parents, has basically dedicated their life to getting to where they are in the company that they work for and getting respect and trust, getting a proper contract rather than being a temp. But both of them seem to lack female friendships for different reasons, that they struggle kind of with social settings, social environments, sort of sometimes reading the signs, knowing how to react. And one of them, the working one, reads the blog of the other one and seems to essentially become a bit fascinated and fixated on them. And over time, over the course of the book, it ends up being made to seem like they're sort of doing some stalking. The blogger person obviously becomes more aware of this, more scared, kind of struggles with it, and makes friendships with some other people as well, but potentially seems to fall into some of those same traps. And the thing for me about this book is it definitely very much focuses on the character flaws. But throughout the whole book, I kept waiting for them to have this big epiphany of, I see what's happened, I'm wrong, I'm going to change, and see them change, see them put that into action. But throughout the whole book, they both are these really strong, seemingly independent female characters that want to show the world that they're great, they're fantastic, they can do all of these things. But they don't seem to at any point in time accept their own flaws or hold accountability for it. They're always blaming it on someone else, something else, a time in their past, a time in their present, or a small thing that happened somewhere, a bigger thing that happened. And it really started to grate on me. Because if you're going to be a really strong female person in any walk of life, you need to be willing to own up to your mistakes. And they didn't. At one point, we got close, but then they seemed to laugh it off a little bit, and it just bothered me. And like I said, it didn't really feel like there was any plot development. We went through a story of events happening from start to finish, but it felt like we didn't get anywhere, that we were in a vicious cycle with these people. But I wanted something dramatic, something big to happen, whether it was a positive or a negative, just for something to happen. And it didn't. So whilst the writing was good, whilst there was some development, whilst there were some good characters in there, though they were mainly just side characters, that was it. And yeah, I wouldn't be reaching for it again. I wouldn't be going out of my way to read it. I recommend it. Clearly, other people did enjoy it and did like it, but it didn't quite do what it needed to for me. I then read another book on NetGalley, so another ebook, and this was A Daddy for Christmas by Lizzie Spriggs. It's obviously not in season at all, but it came through, so I wanted to give it a read. And whilst it isn't seasonal, obviously to be reading that at the minute, I think this is a book that you could potentially read any time of year. Yes, it has a few Christmassy references, a few sort of Christmassy things going on, you know, especially when it mentions, say, gingerbread scents quite a lot. But you could pretty much put this story into any particular big event time. So it's a case of sort of one of them is renting a flat from the other. So Julian's renting a flat from Sid, and then Sid turns up drunk one day, barging into this flat, ends up staying over, and actually the guy that stays in the flat's name isn't Julian. Julian is their boyfriend. It's very difficult to keep track of lots of characters when they all have sort of a very similar name. So it's Lucas that is in a relationship with Julian, and Sid crashes at Lucas's flat, which, like I said, Sid technically owns. And, you know, Lucas says, well, look, I'm in this predicament. Can you come with me to my boyfriend's family Christmas, basically? They travel along. And it becomes very clear very quickly that they don't seem to fit in, and everything isn't right in terms of the relationships and things. And in some ways, it's kind of, I'm not going to say enemies to friends to lovers, because they're never really enemies when they're in the flat together. It's more just a bit of confusion, a bit of sort of distrust. But, you know, it blooms into a friendship, and then it's a question of, will it go further? When it says sort of a daddy for Christmas, it doesn't mean in the sort of the kink kind of way, in the sort of the spice way. It does more mean in the, you know, Sid is pretending to be Lucas's dad, essentially, rather than, like I said, rather than it kind of being the other kind. There's definitely some very mild spice scenes in here. It ramps up a little bit more the further into the book you get, but it definitely eases you into it. It isn't too terribly descriptive or anything like that. I did give that a 4-star read. There were certain bits in it that, and again, I appreciate it was a NetGalley copy, so it hasn't been fully released yet, but there were some bits that did take me out of the story in terms of spelling errors, grammatical errors, and a few other things sort of along those lines. And then I did just find that there wasn't always enough description. I had to do a lot of visual mental work to be able to figure out what the characters looked like and sort of piece all of the little tiny snippets together, because there wasn't that deep description at any point in time. Another 4-star read that I ended up, in this case, listening to in April was My Husband's Wife by Alice Feeney. And I haven't read Alice Feeney before, so I was a little bit unsure of what to think going into it. I know that sort of they can be a loved or not necessarily hated author, but that for quite a few people it can sometimes be missing the mark. But I definitely found this to be a very complex sort of story. And the further on we got, the more I was able to keep up to date and up to speed and figure things out and start to understand extra bits. It was nice to see sort of everything being put together a bit more. But I will say that there were definitely moments where I wished we'd had more perspective from some people or less perspective. You know, there were some characters that seemed to be involved but not involved enough that we touched upon, we had conversations with, but they came and went. And as a reader, if we'd have had a bit more, I could have perhaps been led to the outcome of the story a bit more as to who's the real wife, who's the fake wife. You know, at one point in here, there's somebody that ends up seemingly dead. How did that happen? If we'd have had a few more pointers, I think as a reader, we could have figured it out a little bit more ourselves instead of having to wait all the way until the last chapter, because the chapter that explained who did what, ultimately, we could never have got that from anything before it. And there is sometimes a niceness in that, in where we're just getting taken along with the story and we're not having to mentally try to figure it out. But it would have been nice if we'd had the choice or the opportunity to have any idea of what happened. But I will potentially be reading other Alice Feeney books in the future. I'm not sure whether I'll listen to them as audiobooks or as sort of a physical book, but I do want to try to give them a go at some point. Staying on the 4-star theme, I then listened to An Inheritance of Lies by Rebecca A. Carter. And again, this was a book that I got through Nightingale, but like I said, it was one of the audiobook ones that they had. And this one is essentially about a woman in America that's parents have died. And this is right at the very start of the book, where she's trying to figure out what to do. She's gone into sort of a bar or a pub the night before the reading of the will or the inheritance with her uncle present. And it doesn't exactly go as she expected it to do. There are some clauses, essentially, that the only way she'll get her wealth is if she becomes married. So she goes into this big panicked frenzy, trying to essentially find a fake marriage. So it is definitely a fake marriage trope, but they are still then made to go, her and her prospective partner, on a boat back to England with the uncle. But all isn't as it seems. You know, there's scandal, there's lies, there's drama throughout the entire book that makes you question, will she ever get her inheritance? Who will survive? Who won't survive? What will happen? And it was definitely a very captivating story. There were definitely certain bits of sort of historical fact as well that were woven into there, that it was a nice little nod and appreciation to, for things that I hadn't necessarily mentioned quite as much. But for me, it ended up being 4 stars just because at the very end, it became the very last chapter or so, where it was kind of like, here we are now. Just felt very unrealistic or unbelievable, perhaps. It didn't necessarily make sense to me. I know that it was alluded to through the book that it would happen, but in my head, that wouldn't have actually realistically happened once everyone had got off the boat and sort of gone about their ways. But it was a good listen. It was an enjoyable listen. I just wouldn't say it was one of my favourite books of ever, or definitely of the month. Then I ended up rating one 3.75 stars because it isn't my kind of book. I'm not the target audience for it, but it was The Book of Dead Days by Marcus Sedgwick. And it's the first book in a series. I won't be continuing the series, but I did happen to get it at a sort of a free little local library, and I thought that the plot itself sounded quite good, where it's kind of the space in between Christmas and New Year's, where kind of time goes a bit crazy and everything kind of seems a bit bewildering and you don't know whether you're coming or going or what's happening. But it essentially follows someone that seems to be a magician, potentially a magician, and 2 children that end up helping him along the way. There's drama along there, there's death, there's near-death experiences, there's sort of being captured, sort of jailed, and escapes, and sort of a wild goose chase on sort of an elaborate treasure hunt, essentially. And we slowly sort of start to find out why, that one of them has at one point made sort of a pact, and they're now worried that pact's going to come back to bite them, and they're trying to do everything to make sure that their time doesn't run out. And that obviously has dreadful implications along the way. So it was very well written. It was a very good put together story. It's just obviously where it is for a younger audience, it didn't necessarily have quite that level of depth that as an adult reader I would want or need. But it was definitely an enjoyable read all the same. I then listened to a super speedy audiobook through the library, and that was The House, and it's a Mason Falls mysteries book by Raylan Drake. And I ended up giving it 4 stars because it was actually a pretty good read, especially for how short it was. It had lots of fun little descriptions. It had a nice little plot. It was kind of a cosy plot to go with it. It had a heartwarming thing there, and the outcome of it was quite nice. It provided a little bit of amusement and sort of a little bit of historical not necessarily real historical background, but it provided a little bit of world building, fact building, and everything as well. So even though it was really short, it was enjoyable. Obviously, where it was so short, it could have gone into a little bit more detail. It could have elaborated on a few more things, provided a bit of extra description in terms of characters or what sort of things actually looked like. But it was a good enough, simple read. Now, the last 2 books that I finished in April are both less than 3 stars. We have a 2.75 star, and that's for The Guest List by Lucy Foley. I'm going to say here that I will try and read other Lucy Foley books in the future, that I did enjoy the writing style and everything, but the plot ended up becoming bothersome to me. I really enjoyed the way that we had all of the different perspectives, and near the end of the book, they all say, and then the lights went out. Because essentially, they're going through all of the events that happened on this island as part of sort of this wedding party there, and why they potentially have the murder to commit the crime that happens, what I'm trying to say, commit the murder that ends up happening. But we go through, and then the lights went out for all of them, and then there's another sort of couple of chapters and scenes after it, but I still don't actually know which one of them committed the murder. And I've thought about it, and I'm like, yes, so I can see all of them having these motives, but they then also have characters and personalities that would suggest that they wouldn't do it. We've got one that seems to be struggling so much that they're more likely to unalive themselves than someone else. We have one that seems to be at mental turmoil with what they did as children, but that they're very unlikely to want to repeat that and become what they think some of the others have become. We have one that, yes, wanted a discussion and potentially revenge, but would they? And then we have someone else that in the spur of the moment has found something out. They do seem to be filled with rage, but would they do that? And I don't know who did it. I don't know who did it. There isn't enough points. Sometimes there are books where you can feel like you're wrong when it comes to who did it, and you're fine with that. There can be ones where you've been led down a really clear path, or what you think is a really clear path, and it turns out to somebody else. I'm fine with that because they've built it up enough for me to believe one route. But this could have been any of them, could have been none of them. Nothing took me down a route that when we came to the outcome, I was convinced that was the actual outcome. I didn't. Yeah. It irked me, but the writing was good. The development of the plot was great. We just seemed to miss the mark right at the very end. Then the other book I ended up giving 2.5 stars was Silver Sparrow by Tayari Jones, because this ends up following essentially a secret family where the dad does seem to have some involvement, but he already has a wife and a child, so they kind of go around separate lives, but they become more intermingled and everything. But right at the very start of the book, it explains that this was something that was happening in certain parts of the country or the city at this time, and that there was precedent for it, and that yes, there was sort of shock and everything, but it didn't ever kind of go into too much detail on that. So we obviously are following mainly the secret family, trying to navigate everything with it and the life. But there's never mention of too many repercussions about it. There's a point where the daughter's really young and she draws a picture that her teachers have asked them to draw of sort of family, and then she kind of tries to explain it to the teacher, and yes, she takes the picture home and shows it to the two parents, and the parents are obviously a bit concerned, but there isn't ever any more discussion about that. There's never mentioning of the mum having to have a discussion with the teacher or anything like that. And it feels that, yes, we're very plot driven. We're fine. We're going along. We're seeing what's happening. We're seeing, do these two families end up sort of meeting at any point? Does the official family end up finding out about, the secret sort of child, the secret marriage, everything like that? But there's not really then any mention of it anywhere else. If it was sort of happening a lot, there isn't any mention of, scandal. Mrs. Jones died Mr. Jones died last week, and Mrs. and Mrs. Jones both turned up. That could have been interwoven into it a little bit more to make it feel like it was more something that did happen in that particular time frame, in that particular city, a bit more than it just being this one niche situation for this sort of the characters that are in this book. But it was a decent enough reader, in my case, a decent enough listen, but it didn't wow me at all. It had more flaws than it did positives for me, which is why it ended up falling below that 3-star rating. But that is all of the books that I did end up finishing in April. So quite a few books, obviously, like I say, hits and misses for a few things, but not too bad overall. And I'm hoping that May will turn out to be a decent enough reading sort of time. I will obviously let you know at the end of May, the sort of start of June, what I did end up reading throughout May as well. But I might end up doing to be read for May, sort of to give myself some aims, because I have so many books behind me, some others dotted around that I haven't read, need to read as well. But until then, thank you so much for taking the time to join. If you aren't already, please do consider liking and subscribing. And until I catch you again, do take care and bye for now.